So we're here today with Ken Stroupe, Chief of Staff of the University of Virginia Center for Politics. He is going to introduce himself and talk to you a little bit about his experiences with public policy and communications. So Ken, thank you.
Well, it's great to be here and great to be talking with your group, even if it's indirectly. I've been involved in politics and especially in communications of politics and public policy for almost 25 years now. I started out on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., worked for two members of the House of Representatives. Was very lucky at a really young age. I was 23 years old at the time, and I had imagined that I would stay in Washington and make a career out of being on Capitol Hill. But one of the members of the House of Representatives who I worked for at the time decided that he was going to run for governor of Virginia. And I truthfully imagined that he was going to lose that race, as did most of Virginia, frankly. At the time, he was not well known. His opponent was far better known. So I thought it would be a great experience to have a statewide campaign kind of under my belt at 24 years old. And then I'd come back to Washington. The funny thing that happened was he won. He was elected governor, and I was then appointed by the governor to be the communications director. And I had three sort of agencies, if you will, under me. Public relations, speech writing, and then the way that governor's office was organized, I had some components of constituent services, specifically these proclamations and those sort of official recognitions that are really there essentially for the PR value of it and nothing more.
So was there anything in the campaign that you did? Were you in charge of communications for the campaign? Is that how you were recommended?
I was actually a press secretary on Capitol Hill, and then became, and I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, at 23 years old, to be able to be a press secretary on Capitol Hill, it was a lot of learning on the job. Your audience may be aware of this, but the appointments in congressional offices are largely people who have been involved in that campaign. They're not necessarily there because they have any great expertise.
So it's a little bit of learning on the go. Absolutely.
It was a great deal of learning on the go, and Capitol Hill has its own way of doing so many different things. There's very little that you, as a communications person, have to outsource when you're working on Capitol Hill. It has its own radio stations, its own television studios, its own print, an entire print section in the basement of the Capitol. So you just had to learn where to go in the Capitol and how to use those resources.
So it's a good place to kind of get your feet wet in learning different strategies, because you kind of have everything in one place.
It's a good place, absolutely. It's a great place to learn that sort of stuff. But the mistake one makes is you come out of there thinking the entire world operates that way. That everywhere you go there will be, a printer in the basement and television studios and radio stations, and of course it's not the case.
And that's not the case in Richmond.
It's absolutely not the case. I mean, the governor has a fair amount of resources available to him, but there are no television stations for members of the General Assembly. There's a public television station there, but the resources of Washington, D.C. are really vast, and especially for members of Congress.
So when you went to work for the governor, what were the particular, imagine on the first couple of days of the job, it must have been kind of overwhelming. What did you see as your biggest challenges, and then what things did you have to learn kind of quickly?
Well, state government, Virginia's the 12th largest state by population, and it has a really large public workforce in just the executive branch of state government. So it's more than 100,000 employees in a state that is today 8 million plus constituents. So I think the biggest lesson for me, my exposure to Virginia at that point had been through the sort of eyes and ears and services that a member of Congress offers. So you learn a district, a region of a state really well when you work for, especially a member of the House of Representatives. But when you work for a governor, you represent the entire state, and the governor is responsible for the entire state. And Virginia has a lot of variance in our population, in our geography. You know, in a matter of just a few hours, you go from all of the unique needs of a tidewater region, beach area of the state, all the way into the far southwest portions of Virginia, where people in cities out there, they're much closer. Bristol, Virginia, for example, is actually much closer to 6 other state capitals than it is to Richmond, our own capital. So really just finding ways to be able to communicate to this far-flung society with so many different competing needs. What might work for a really technologically sophisticated region like Northern Virginia would not work in an area where I'm from, like the Shenandoah Valley, where there are very few television stations. Then, when I worked in the governor's office, there was no social media, there was no internet. We were just learning what email was at that time. So you had to rely a great deal, if you wanted to get your message out, you had to rely on print media and radio, especially for the more rural areas of the state. So it was really finding, you couldn't rely on one way to get your message out. You had to rely really on every resource that was available to you. And sometimes that meant even faxing information to places or calling them on the telephone to be able to, you know, have that rebroadcast as a radio actuality or something like that. Printed flyers were then a really big way to get your message out as well. Parades. We sort of underestimate how important parades, public events were not so much anymore because we have so many different ways to communicate. But often a parade was the way that people would be the only way that people might see their elected officials.